Hey, what's up, guys? This is Adam D'Angeli from the Rescue Mission Coalition, and in this video, I want to talk about the free market and free market solutions and how to address the perspective of people who are strongly supportive of the free market some of the arguments that we've been talking about on related legislation, such as vaccine choice, such as the ability of banks to deplatform somebody for political purposes, as happened to General Michael Flynn, reported yesterday. Chase Bank shut off his credit cards and said, we don't want to do business with you anymore because you are a liability to our reputation. Something which is obviously absolute bullshit. Let's make no bones about that. Nobody on the planet essentially knew that Michael Flynn banked with Chase Bank, and Michael Flynn wasn't going out telling people, by the way, my bank is Chase Bank. Nobody knew that, but they shut down his credit cards and closed his bank account. And the reaction from free market people is, well, he can just bank somewhere else. And I don't know that that's going to be true. Maybe in the short term, maybe not in the long term. In fact, there's a story we'll go over in a little bit of somebody who was absolutely, totally frozen out of the banking system in the United States, and that absolutely destroyed his business. But the bigger question I wanted to address here, particularly with vaccine mandates, is there are some lawmakers on the Republican side who are strong believers in free market principles. And the reason that they would oppose prohibiting private entities from requiring vaccines as a condition of employment is a free market argument that people have alternatives that, well, let's get into the entire free market argument here. And by the way, part of the reason why I want to address this is because these are also arguments I strongly believe. My background is working for Ron Paul and supporting him on all of his positions, and his positions derived largely from, well, I mean, he's his own man, obviously, but it came from the libertarian philosophy, which was largely very eloquently described by Murray Rothbard. And before Murray Rothbard was Ludwig von Mises. And the entire libertarian philosophy is based on free market principles, that the government's always the problem. And it's an extraordinarily powerful and effective theory because of its simplicity. And they have, over the years, developed answers for just about everything. In fact, Murray Rothbard really laid it out very well in his book, The Ethics of Liberty, which described the libertarian philosophy as an ethical philosophy. And people like Ron Paul, Murray Rothbard have answers to all of these things on every criticism of the free market. And largely practical answers. Sometimes theoretical answers, because you have to deal with the realities of the real world, but was very well articulated, very well understood, and it's led to a lot of people, number one, having those principles and looking to apply them to every aspect of public policy and saying there must be some other way. You know, if Rescue Mission comes out and says we should support legislation to prohibit private entities from requiring someone to mandate a vaccine, surely there is some free market answer to that doesn't involve the government telling corporations what they can and can't do. And these are robust arguments, and they have to be challenged in a way that makes sense to the people that advocate for free market policies, because a lot of the arguments that you or me might make are going to be unavailing to someone that is going to be rigidly sticking to that principle. And I'll give you a great example of this. A couple of years ago, Representative Riley, and I was working for him at the time, we were looking to confront social media censorship. And the free market argument against social media censorship was these are private companies, they can do whatever they want. And in the libertarian philosophy, the idea was, well, if a company is going to be discriminating against the free speech of people, it will alienate their users. It will drive them towards alternatives. It will create, although the market will always eventually have a correction. And that's a fair argument. Of course, you might envision there being some problems with that. Number one, that these big tech giants are constantly gobbling up every alternative to Google and Facebook. So I think it was Facebook that bought Instagram, and so on it goes. But there's still the argument, well, some other big company out there is going to want to make money and they're going to want to get people to come someplace else. And it's unavailing to a free market thinker to say, well, obviously the people that are expelled from Facebook and Twitter to form their own community, such as you might find on Parler or Rumble or any other alternative, is going to be a smaller community because Facebook and Twitter and Google and the rest are not exercising enough censorship that the majority of the public perceives it, right? So you can form your own community, but you're going to miss out on the essential benefits that people perceive of Google and Facebook, which is that they are essentially the public square because they're where everybody else is. And that's the reason why most of us got on social media, is because everybody else is there, and that's the way that you have to reach them. So we developed legislation to try to address the social media censorship problem, but from a free market perspective. And what we came up with, actually, I derived it from a bill I found in Texas, where they made the consumer fraud argument, because I don't think most libertarians would agree that consumer fraud is admissible. I mean, the whole notion of free market theory is based on the right of contract. And if you have a contract that's fraudulent, then you've got a problem. And so what we came up with was House Bill 4801, which said that an individual should have the right to pursue a claim of consumer fraud against a social media company that holds itself out as politically neutral, as neutral to content, neutral to viewpoint, obviously not including clear things that should not be allowed on social media, like pornography and things like that. Although, as it happens, Facebook and Twitter are in fact the largest traffickers of child pornography in the world, but they selectively do censor conservatives, conservative viewpoints, and more recently, any viewpoint that just does not go along with the line of the American establishment. So there are people on the left who question vaccines. There are people on the left that question whether or not the government should have the right to control your body, but they're all expunged from Twitter and Facebook. And of course, they're at this point even censoring public figures, people that simply repeat published statements in medical journals like Alex Berenson, and on it goes. So our bill was to say that if a social media company holds themselves out as a content neutral platform, but they're in fact not doing that, and they're selectively censoring their users, that they should be able to be sued by their users for their damages. Which in theory, they already have that right, but the problem is it's a very big uphill battle in courts. Having a statutory underpinning to that right is important. And one change that we made from the Texas bill was the Texas bill said the Attorney General only would have that cause of action. And obviously in Michigan, our Attorney General is worthless. So we made an individual cause of action. If you are harmed by a social media network, and deplatformed for content reasons. But at the same time, that social media platform is telling the planet, which they all do, that they're a platform for everybody and everybody is entitled to speak. Then they're committing consumer fraud and you're entitled to damages. That's what House Bill 4801 was intending to do. And we had a hearing in the House Communications and Technology Committee in 2019. Now, the House Communications and Technology Committee at that time had 3 Republican members on the committee and 2 Democrats. And the Democrats Democrats always have, they have no moral underpinnings whatsoever, so they just figured, yeah, social media censoring conservatives is great, so there was no hope whatsoever of getting them to support this legislation. But we had our hearing. Michelle Hoytinga was the chair of that committee. I think she still is. And Doug Wozniak was on that committee at that time. He's now actually just recently got elected to the state senate. But the third Republican was Steve Johnson, who is sort of a Ron Paul type, you could say, or maybe Justin Amash type would be more accurate, a free market libertarian type who also just happens to hate Donald Trump and hear no evil, see no evil with respect to election fraud and what have you. But at this time, in 2019, Johnson was obviously not known for his positions on the upcoming election. And frankly, had a reputation for being a strong conservative. He and my boss, Rep. Riley, were voting in common more often than anybody else. He was someone who was considered a very strong, free market principled conservative, and maybe he is. But I think that's where his opposition to this bill, which killed the bill, this is why the bill died in that committee, was he refused to support it. And his basic answer was, I don't consider this a free market solution. And we met with him and discussed it with him. And, I said, look, I understand your position on the free market. I agree with it. I don't think that a free market allows for fraud. And that's why our bill, it doesn't say you can't censor people on your own website. I understand you have a right to regulate speech within the context of your own company. That's why our bill was written, to evade that argument. The fact is, all we say is that if a social media company holds itself out as content neutral and viewpoint neutral, when in fact it's actually extraordinarily censorious of conservative viewpoints, right-wing viewpoints, anything that's not to the radical left, that they're actually committing fraud because their viewers had the expectation that they wouldn't be censored. Their viewers don't have the ability to know to what extent social media is censoring their posts. And these are problems. So that was our Bill 4801 of 2019. You can look it up, and in fact, I will show you on the screen. This is the testimony of an organization opposing our bill, and this comes from a group called netchoice.org. And what it was doing was essentially appealing to Representative Steve Johnson's sensibilities. And rather than making the left-wing arguments, because they knew the left-wingers weren't going to support the bill anyway, they're appealing to the right wing. So they say this bill is unconstitutional. It follows in the failed footsteps of the Fairness Doctrine. Now, if you're not familiar with the Fairness Doctrine, it was an eventually overturned law that said that every news agency had an obligation to air both sides of every story. And of course, what that led to was political attacks on people like, for example, Rush Limbaugh, and saying, you have not, because what was going on was the federal government was saying you have to provide the left-wing side of your story with your right-wing commentary. And there's all kinds of problems with this. Obviously, First Amendment problems, obviously practical problems. How is someone who's a right-wing person supposed to provide an objective, honest appraisal of the left-wing answer to it? It would subject everybody to endless lawsuits, and it would work the other way on the other side. But of course, the reason why there was this fairness law was originally to censor conservatives on talk radio. That was the problem they were trying to address, and that was the problem that conservatives successfully defeated in the courts, and proving that it was infringement on their First Amendment rights. And of course, the way this is invoked here is totally irrelevant and misleading. But that was their second claim. The next claim, and here again, you can see how they're trying to appeal to the free market disposition of reps like Steve Johnson by saying things like, this injects government into the operation of private businesses, violating notions of free enterprise. And then finally saying this is unnecessary because the Michigan Attorney General, the left-wing lunatic Dana Nessel, already has the power to take action against unfair or deceptive acts. And of course, even if our Attorney General was not a left-wing lunatic, even if it was some middle-of-the-road Republican like Bill Schuette or something, it still is important in litigation if you underpin your cause of action with legislation that strengthens your case. So that's obviously ridiculous. But just to go through, these are the arguments that the quote-unquote free market people make, and of course, just to be clear, NetChoice is not any kind of free market organization. This is NetChoice. This is their website, netchoice.org. Members are members of big tech: Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Chinese TikTok, Chinese Alibaba, and you've got eBay, and you've got PayPal, which was founded by a right-winger, but it's now controlled by a leftist, and all these other organizations. And of course, they're passionately opposed to any regulation of big tech. They're categorized right here as Silicon Valley's most aggressive lobbying presence in Washington, according to Politico. But you'll see they've got people like, for example, here's a event they have, American Antitrust, where their keynote speaker is Senator Mike Lee of Utah, someone who, on other political issues, is considered to be one of the great conservatives, like a Rand Paul or Ted Cruz type, but obviously totally supporting big tech on this matter. And I don't know what's in Mike Lee's heart of hearts, but the arguments that Steve Johnson and Justin Amash and Mike Lee are going to marshal against consumer fraud and against antitrust legislation are going to be free market arguments. And these are important because these same people are going to be making these same arguments against prohibiting corporations from requiring you to take a vaccine as a condition of employment, against legislation to prohibit banks from being able to kick you off because of your political affiliations or your political statements, things that never should even occur in the real world to begin with. So anyway, so this is Carl Szabo, President, Vice President, and General Counsel of NetChoice. The big tech companies themselves didn't even bother to appear in this hearing. That's how little they thought of the Michigan legislature. There was no representative from Facebook or Google or anybody else. They have so little respect for the Michigan legislature, they just sent this guy as their errand boy. And they make these silly arguments. So in the first, they say it violates the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The First Amendment guarantees the right to speak, not a right to be heard. That means we're allowed to censor anybody on the platform. And again, all of this is totally ignoring the actual substance of the bill, which is not to say that a company doesn't have the right to censor their content, but they don't have a right to lie about it. So this goes on. Consider the phrase, they say here, consider the phrase, our site is for civil and public discourse. That could suggest neutrality. However, removal of hate speech could be interpreted by one judge to violate neutrality and interpreted by another judge to be in line with the statement. Well, the problem is that these big tech platforms have said more than just that. And more importantly is also the interpretation of the user. There's an understanding, and again, this goes back, and this is where we start to get into the free market problems with these arguments, is that in contract law, which is the basis of every free market transaction, when you buy a loaf of bread, that's a contract between you and your supermarket. You're giving them money and they're giving you a loaf of bread. Simple and straightforward and assumed, implied, not in writing. But the basis of every free market interaction is a mutual understanding between the two partners. And that's where the free market issue starts to break down with respect to, in this case, big tech. Is that people signed under these platforms having the understanding they weren't going to be censored for their political views. And then, of course, that was all, the rug was pulled out from under them. Then they say HB 4801 follows in the footsteps of the infamous fairness doctrine, and this is all complete gibberish. Has nothing to do with the fairness doctrine. In fact, it's funny they quote Ronald Reagan here saying, quote, "This type of content-based regulation by the federal government is, in my judgment, antagonistic to the freedom of expression guaranteed by the First Amendment. Such federal policing of the editorial judgment of journalists would be unthinkable." And of course, that's applicable to exactly the censorship that's taking place on big tech platforms right now. They are engaging in content-based regulation. That is what they are doing. And what our bill is asking for, or was asking for at the time, was to not lie about it, to not tell everybody that we're going to regulate your speech, to tell everybody we're not going to regulate your content of your speech, but in fact, that's, of course, precisely what they did, knowingly, intentionally, and with political animus and motivations. HB 4801 injects government into the operation of private businesses, violating the notions of free enterprise. And of course, this is just absolutely ridiculous, because all the bill ever asked was for a company not to lie to people. That's as far as it goes. That is already protected by the law. And then to that point, existing laws already address the concerns of HB 4801. Yes, but not well enough, not thoroughly enough. And as they say here, the Attorney General can bring an action against a platform for misrepresentation under the FTC Act. And by the way, Republican attorneys general in other states, you ought to. But in Michigan, we don't have that option. But that's not fair to the individuals in Michigan who are being harmed by these social media networks who routinely lie about how they administer their content over and over and over again. And they should have the standing to pursue an action in that respect. So anyway, that was the position of NetChoice on our bill against consumer fraud by the major social media networks. But, as I was discussing this I remember talking to Representative Johnson myself, and I was explaining to him, this is not about what they can't do. It's fraud that we're preventing. He says, this is not a free market solution. And that's just a glossing over, a non-answer to this entire argument. But that's where some of these guys are. That's where Rep. Johnson, unfortunately, fell on this issue. I hope this bill goes farther in this legislature. I don't know if Rep. Riley has even reintroduced it yet. I hope he does. The Communications and Technology Committee is more favorable now. I think Steve Johnson is not on it anymore, so I hope they do bring it up and pursue it. But the point is, there are ways to challenge the notion of what a free market should do that still actually do fall within the purview of libertarian free market theories. So let's now turn to, well, before we get into the vaccine choice, let's talk about the Michael Flynn case. Well, it's not a case, it's the Michael Flynn incident. He's been kicked off of Chase Bank, and of course the libertarian will respond, well, he'll bank elsewhere. And that's true as it goes for the time being, as we know, but there's a lot of reasons to doubt that that's going to go, that's going to be the end of this. And there's a much bigger story relating to one in particular individual I'm going to talk about. His real name is Dax Herrera. He is an internet personality, goes by Dick Masterson. And he runs a podcast called The Dick Show. And it's just, his personality, so he's macho man guy and all that. Great guy, great commentary and all that. But he became concerned about the censorship that was coming from a similar social media platform called Patreon, and ended up basically devising his own alternative to Patreon. If you don't know what Patreon is, it's a system where you can pay money to a content creator, whether they're a podcast or they have a YouTube show or whatever else they have, to give you access to private content based on how much you give. So if you give $5 a month, you can see this. If you get $10 a month, you can see that. And it's all very primitive by as far as the technical aspect of it. It's all simple. There's nothing to it. You just have a basic user system and a basic contribution system, and you put content behind a paywall that people that don't pay the money don't get to see. That's all there is to it. It's simple. Any moron could do it. I could probably do it. Well, Dick Masterson did do it, and he created something called newproject2.com, and he got a bunch of his friends who also are content creators to go to newproject2.com. They also had better prices than Patreon did. They took a lower cut, so people were supporting that, and it got labeled by a left-wing brigade as a platform for right-wing extremism and so on and so forth. And before you know it, he was deplatformed, not from any social network because he basically built his own platform, but by the banks. And they literally shut down his ability to process credit cards and thereby destroyed his business. And what they did was they put him on something called the match list. In fact, let me hold on. I'm gonna see if I can pull up a story about this. But what happened was there's this thing called the match list that essentially says that if you're on this list, you can't bank anywhere. Let me see if I can find the video about this. Let's see. I don't want to leave dead air on here, so maybe I'll put a link in the description. So that's what we have to do. But what essentially happened was the banks have a network that says who you can't bank with. And of course, they've got people on the list like terrorists and things like that. And they've got this weird catch-all for other. And he somehow got put onto that other list. And once you're on there, you can never get out. And it destroyed his website, destroyed his business. And that kind of stuff is coming. What we saw with the censorship of General Mike Flynn is only the beginning. It's unpersoning somebody whose political views are not tolerated. Not because of any crime he committed. He's never been accused of any crime. Not convicted of any crime, at least. Accused by some left-wing lunatics, but that's how it goes. But that the fact that Chase Bank would say your affiliation with us, which nobody on the planet knew about or cared about, would damage our reputation, is paving the way for big banks to block people from banking with them. And it's coming soon. When you get deplatformed from one bank, you'll soon be deplatformed from certainly all of the major ones. And that's going to be an enormous problem going forward. But now let's get back to talking about how this relates to the vaccine mandate. Because we have a bill by Rep. Sue Aller to say that an employer can't require vaccine paperwork as a condition of employment. So how, within the framework of a free market, can you say a company doesn't have the right to do that? Let's first walk through what the free market argument is about this. The free market argument is, well, if your company won't allow you to work for them because of your vaccine status, that's their loss. And you'll go to work for some other company. There's a couple of problems with that. The first problem is that it's not a small deal for someone to find another job someplace else. The labor market is complicated, it's difficult, it's not easy to just get another job, especially when you've just lost your previous job and you've got to explain to a prospective employer why now you're looking for new employment. It can take a considerable amount of time. It involves an element of risk. And if you're working for a company, you have to weigh your ability to get another job elsewhere with the damage it's going to do to you and your family. And here's the fundamental issue that I see. When people got a job in 2019 or before that, or even in 2020, they had no expectation whatsoever that their employer could ever possibly impose this condition on them because it was at the time unimaginable. And, labor agreements can vary. Sometimes they're totally informal, there's nothing in writing. Oftentimes, there'll be a few minor things in writing saying what our policy is on this and this and this, and you sign a paper saying that, which never said that you're agreeing to be compelled to take an experimental drug as a condition of your employment and you're surrendering your medical privacy. Now, there is a concept in law called contracts of adhesion. And these are what you see when you often will subscribe to a website or something, and a website will say, by clicking this button, you agree to our terms of service, and you agree that we're allowed to change the terms of service anytime we want, and if you don't want to be bound by them, too bad. But there are all kinds of legal problems with this type of contract, the number one being notice and making sure that the people who agree to the contract are informed on an ongoing basis. The other problem is when contracts are written by one party and the other party signs it, the court normally will read questions of confusion to the benefit of the people that did not author the contract. And of course, always just the big tech companies that are authoring these contracts. Because the assumption is when you enter into an agreement with another party, it's in good faith, it's to the mutual benefit of both parties, but if there's any misleading happening, it's coming from the party that authored the contract, not the party that accepted. And of course, that's what's always the case with employer to employee, with a few rare exceptions. But even then, it's hard to even conceive of someone signing a labor agreement as recently as 2020, thinking that this agreement can be voided because the company has now revised the terms to require that I literally submit my private medical information and take an experimental drug that I might not want or need as a condition of my employment. And again, look, the free market can say, well, there'll be a correction here. You'll have tons of people refusing to refusing to keep their jobs, refusing to take the jab, and therefore some companies will be forced to walk that back. But that's not a given. That's not something anybody can assume. And that's not something that someone should be forced to lose their job over, because their job agreement originally said nothing that spoke to anything about what their condition of the medical status was. In fact, every American worker took a job with the understanding that the Americans with Disability Act said they could not be fired from their job because of a medical condition or even a perceived medical condition. So, for the contract to now be revised to say you have to take a drug as a condition of employment that you had every reason to believe you couldn't accept because that was what was automatically covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, they are now effectively changing the terms of their agreement without your consent, without your knowledge, and with what you assumed when you took that agreement was illegal. And these are important things. We support a free market system. We have the understanding that we have the reality that we do. You can disagree with the Americans with Disabilities Act and tell us a great show about all the problems with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but with the understanding that that was the law of the land, every worker signed that employment contract, or maybe it wasn't signed, but it was understood, was that you could not be discriminated against based upon your medical status. And maybe they would have taken that job or not taken that job, taken a job with somebody else instead, if they actually were to expressly put in writing that you would not have to take a vaccine as a condition of employment. But of course, nobody was offering those terms because no one thought they were necessary. Because there was no legal basis for it at the time, because the Americans with Disabilities Act said, again, agree with it or don't agree with it, but that was the understanding that people had when they reached those labor agreements. And it's not fair to employees to say, oh, it's a free market, we can change the terms, the laws change, so too bad, go get a job somewhere else. And of course, all of this is compounded by the fact that the government is intensely pressuring all these big corporations to adopt these vaccine mandates. So even if you leave your job, you might not be able to find a job in a similarly situated company if they happen to be hiring in the first place, where they won't have that same policy anyway. And it might be okay in some employment situations where there's a high demand for employees, a big market for them because they're not very skilled. Obviously, in the United States right now, that's an enormous problem. And that's too bad. But in a high-skilled profession where there's a small number of corporations that are hiring, where there's a limited degree of companies that are able to hire you, and they may not have to. The smaller the industry, the more unpredictable the job market is. But you're subject to being fired because of this. And this is not a free market scenario at all. This is a scenario that was created entirely by government from start to finish. Government created the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now the government says you should have to take a vaccine as a condition of employment. All of it came from the government. So how can you turn to the free market and say that you no longer you shouldn't have a right to keep your job because the government has, first of all, created the conditions where you had no expectation that your medical privacy would be invaded by the company that hired you, and now you have no expectation that the company can keep you without destroying your medical privacy. So these are huge, huge free market questions. I would throw one more in there, which is the notion of an unconscionable contract. And this might not appeal to the libertarian purists out there, but there is a notion in contract law that if a contract's terms are unconscionable, then the terms are not valid. For example, in theory, in a free market libertarian paradise, you could sell yourself into slavery for the right price, right? Let's say you're a very low income person, you've got a big family to feed, and the billionaire says, I'll give your family $10 million if you sell yourself into my servitude for the rest of your life, surrendering all of your civil rights, all of your civil liberties, all of your medical freedom, and everything else. You will be my slave for the rest of your life. I'll give your family $10 million. It's like the old saying, what's it worth to you? How much, what would you do for $1 million? Well, American courts have said those kind of contracts are unconscionable and therefore unenforceable and illegal, because slavery is illegal and immoral and unconscionable. A libertarian might say, well, for $10 million, right? Of course, they're ignoring why would you sell yourself into slavery for other people's $10 million? But, there's all kinds of reasons in the real world why that could happen. But that's why the courts have said you can't do that. You just can't. It's unconscionable. I would argue a corporation demanding your papers on what medicines you take and demanding that you take a medicine you might not want, might not need, might not trust as a condition of employment is unconscionable. I think it's a cognizable legal argument. So I think for all the reasons that we've discussed, the free market argument against imposing upon corporations the prohibition that they can't suddenly now demand their employees all take an experimental vaccine or even an authorized vaccine that they might not need or want. And of course, authorization is just a creation of the FDA, right? So if you're a libertarian, you don't care about that. Experimental vaccine or an authorized vaccine are the same thing. It's up to the individual to decide what drugs they put in their body. It's not the right of an employer. It's especially not the right of an employer to do that when the people that came into this corporation had no expectation that that's what they would face. So, those are my responses to the libertarian free market arguments against vaccine mandates. And I would encourage people to really consider making these arguments to some of their free market legislators. Because what's going to happen is, just like you have here, where big tech cloaks the totalitarian, their pro-trust arguments, their pro-censorship arguments as a free market argument, they're going to be doing the same to lawmakers. So make the point to them too, this is not a free market. When suddenly the entire weight of the federal government, the entire weight of the political establishment, the entire weight of the media establishment, the entire weight of the medical establishment is coming down on corporations and telling them that they have to impose these mandates. Because maybe these corporations wouldn't actually really want to. But maybe they would if there was some government intervention involved. Like maybe General Motors didn't want to impose vaccine mandates on their employees until about a week after their CEO met with Joe Biden. And suddenly her tune changed, and now General Motors wants to impose vaccine mandates on their employers. Maybe it wasn't the free market where that came from. And maybe the free market is not the answer as to why it's okay to allow them to do that. So, I hope this has been interesting and informative for you guys. And as always, thanks again for all that you do for liberty. Until next time, peace.